Welcome to our town hall. This town hall is sponsored by the numbers guy, Ron Stossel, and Citizens About Responsible Education, 281 CARE. I'm your host, Sheila Qualls, and I write about education for Alpha News, which is Minnesota's largest conservative news outlet. I've produced a 5-part podcast series, an audio podcast series on education in Minnesota. We have looked at it from all angles, and it is called Trapped: Chaos in the Classroom. You can find it at MNTrapped, that's Mike November, trapped.com. And we produce this podcast because we believe that many parents don't know what's going on in our schools. And so we wanted to let them know. So I spent 6 months examining education, public education in Minnesota. And so in this series, I paint a picture of what's going on in our public schools. And I do it through the voices of students and parents and teachers, the people who are in and around public education every single day. Thousands of Minnesota families are trapped in our education system. They're being held hostage by a broken system that is not synced up with traditional American values. It's just at odds. So we thank you for joining us tonight for our town hall, where we're going to be talking about in this segment safety and discipline, or lack thereof, and how those two things are connected in our schools. So thank you for joining me. On our panel tonight, we have Matt, we have Linda, Laurel, and Sam. Matt is a school board member in Anoka Hennepin and a father of 2. Linda is a high school physics and chemistry teacher who has 25 years experience in the public education system. Laurel is a mom, and she and her husband have 3 children in the district, Anoka Hennepin, and Laurel volunteers in the schools and also in the local youth sports. And then we have Sam, who is a student, 16 years old, and he is a sophomore finishing up this year at Anoka Hennepin. So we're going to ask our panel to keep our answers to about 3 minutes each so that everyone has an opportunity to talk, because we have 4 very unique perspectives here and we want to hear from everybody. And at any time, please feel free to chime in. If you've got something to add, if we go to something and you want to go back and address something that we've already talked about, please just feel free to do that. So our education system in Minnesota is a mess. It is an absolute mess. It's crumbling. Kids are disrespectful. They don't respect teachers. They swear. They threaten. They get physical with teachers. When I first started covering education for Alpha News, the stories that I heard from parents, I just thought they weren't true. I thought surely they've got to be exaggerating. But the more I found out, the more I realized that no, people are not exaggerating. Teachers feel unsafe. Students feel unsafe. Teachers feel disrespected. What's going on? What is happening in our public education system? And what's most troubling to me is that administrators don't want people to know what's going on inside of schools. So if you're old enough to remember that old commercial, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happens in our public schools stays in our public schools. Violence is up, accountability is down, and kids lack consequences. So our schools are no longer safe places for our kids. So again, I want to thank you tonight for joining me. We will be talking about discipline and safety. And so what we're hoping to do is answer for our listeners questions and also arm them with information to help them maybe approach their own schools and administration and their school boards. So we'll start with this. About 10 years ago, discipline practices were overhauled in our country. And we went to softer policies in an effort to make discipline in schools more equitable. So we'll start with you, Matt. Can you give us sort of the origin of these new policies? Just give us the origin, where they came from.
Sure. Yeah, as I know it, and part of this I know through my own research of the exact same question, is during the Obama administration, part of their Department of Education started to do some research into something they called the school to prison pipeline, and a concept called disparate impact. And disparate impact is a concept that really just talks about, it could be about any groups of people, but whenever there's a disparity between how one group is affected by something than another group, they call that disparate impact. So the specific to school thing that they were looking at was rates of discipline between white children and children of color. And they noted that there is a disparate impact between the way that children of color the numbers of children of color who are being disciplined compared to white children. And they determined that the policies or the practices in schools were disproportionately impacting these children of color, and they felt that something needed to be done about it. They had made some correlations to school discipline, children being disciplined up through expulsion in schools, and the effect that might have on them. And they had found this correlation that children that are expelled, for instance, have a much greater incidence of eventually winding up in the prison system or either the juvenile or the adult correctional system throughout the course of their life. And so the solution that was determined was we've got to stop having this disparate impact. And so policies at that point from the federal government on down through state governments, there started to be pressure applied to school districts to try to minimize that impact. And from what I can tell, that was the source of when schools began to change. I would kind of say whether they probably liked it or not, because the implication was that the policies and the practices were being influenced by racism or by something else, and that the reason that these children of color were being disciplined at a disparate rate was because of a systemically racist system. And so it needed to be fixed, and government stepped in to fix it.
Okay. And Linda, you have seen, obviously, in the school system, for 25 years, what types of effect, or what effect did these policies or these changes in policies have on the environment in the classroom?
So, yeah, I agree with the idea that this was about 10 years ago. Certainly, we started having meetings that said, you need to make certain that you're not sending kids out of the classroom, period. Like, that just wasn't going to happen. And that immediately changes things. Like, when dangerous situations arise, or just even classroom disruptions, and you say, we need to change course so that we can keep everyone on track learning, and then that idea is removed. You aren't to send anyone out for any reason. So that just immediately impacts in a negative way the amount of curriculum you can get through, the environment, the comfort level of kids. I remember specifically in a class that was very disruptive, and we needed to change things, but I couldn't do anything to send kids out. I had one girl, she would come to class every day and just hug her backpack because she was concerned for her own safety. If you asked her, she probably wouldn't have recognized that she was doing that. It was just a subconscious thing, I bet. But as a teacher, I was concerned for everyone in that classroom. It wasn't good for the kids who were being disruptive. It certainly wasn't good for the classroom environment as a whole.
So did this start specifically with kids of color? Because I know that was, since they had the stats that said, kids of color are, expelled at, I think it was 3.5, almost 4 times more than their white counterparts. So did these policies begin specifically with kids of color in the beginning? Don't send kids of color out?
No one ever said that specifically, but I remember going to meetings where they would put up charts and have contrasting racial groups, and here's what happens, the statistics on each subdivision of students. And it was clear that there must be a reason that we have this discrepancy between different groups of students. And so no one said you need to treat people differently, but it was definitely the underlying context that why is there a difference? Why do you think you would send students of color out of your classroom? Was really the question that they were asking. And so it was very clear. It really made a lot of tension in the group of teachers, because it seemed to be pointing a finger at us, saying that, look at this outcome, it's probably because you are choosing to treat students differently. And so it made everyone uncomfortable and unsafe, untrusting of our peers, really, and just changed the whole playing field and how we should look at discipline, not just to make certain that your classroom is a safe, productive environment, but in fact, it just created a lot of concern.
So when you say they were looking at us, are you saying white teachers specifically?
there definitely became a push to make certain that there was more diversity in the roles of teaching. I remember I've sat on a lot of interview committees, so certainly to change the makeup of the teaching environment. But it is true that at our particular school system, it was mostly mostly teachers were white, and so it definitely was feeling that it was our fault that there was a difference in outcomes.
So, from what I understand, the way that this kind of worked was that they really cut down on the expulsions of kids of color. So, as the mother of a kid who's not a kid of color, what do you think about that when they say we're going to have a race-based discipline policy and we're not going to expel certain kids because of their color, but other kids, well, we're just going to hold them to the traditional rules of discipline?
Well, that's, it's uncomfortable. I wish that there was a rule at the school that would be followed for everybody. I know at our middle school there's been several fights in 2023, and some of that has been confusing. What I've heard from my kids, I don't know the race of any of the kids that were in the fight, but some kids were suspended for more days than other kids. So I don't understand why that happens or what contributes to it. I get that the school can't tell other parents. My kid wasn't involved in the fight. They can't tell me exactly why, but it is confusing to the students too about why some kids are back before other kids.
Well, Sam, do you notice disparity in discipline practices between the black students and the white students?
I would say they're equal. They're about equal, but not really in a good way. Like, they really just cut down on the way that they discipline kids. Like, I would say I rarely get a class where a teacher would pull a kid out of class or give them a slip to go to the office. So I would say they're about equal, but not in a good way, like I said.
So what do you mean equal but not equal?
Like, they just wouldn't be disciplined like as they kind of should be, like, for everyone. So, like, if someone is maybe talking back to the teacher or like disrespecting the teacher, they just, instead of one would be pulled out of class versus the other, they just wouldn't be pulled out of class at all.
This leads into this whole thing of this restorative justice, of this situation where we want to return kids, back to the classroom as soon as possible. So instead of being punitive, we're going to be positive, and we're not going to expel students, and we're gonna, when they are, when they do something wrong or disrespectful, we're gonna just sort of try to restore them to the classroom as quickly as possible. So, Linda, as a teacher, what does that do to your control in the classroom? What do you have at your disposal?
Yeah. The really challenging part is that restorative justice piece that you're talking about. If you have a student who's really disruptive continuously day after day, and you need to interact, you go and talk with the principal, say, what can we do about this? Because you certainly can't send them out. Kind of to Sam's good point is that there's really no mechanism even for sending a kid out of class. So they say, oh, well, have you built a relationship with them? Have you spent time making certain that they know that you care about their education? Well, of course, I care about everyone's education. I'm a teacher, that's why I'm there. But I don't have time in a classroom with 35 kids. It's the third day of school. When did I have time to build a relationship with this kid? And that, of course, perpetuates through the time. We know, anyone who's spent time in a classroom knows that the kids who are the loudest get the most attention anyway. So probably you are disproportionately spending time with that student. But the argument would be, but is it positive time? Have you spent time to say things that build up their confidence? And it says, I would love to do that, but we have limitations in the classroom. I need to make certain that the environment is safe and that we can have attention for everyone in the class, not just those students who are creating the most demand for the attention.
Mm-hmm. So the powers that be thought that if we change discipline, the approach from punitive to positive, we could teach kids about empathy and seeing things from each other's perspective. So around that time, we had what was known as the Dear Colleague letter that came out from the Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan. And this was designed to make discipline practices more equitable. And so they started equity training for teachers. And so what this did, though, was in actuality, it took discipline away from the local school districts and it placed it in the hands of the federal government. And I don't know, but many things that get placed in the hands of the federal government don't end up looking the way that we think that they're supposed to look. So taking discipline out of the hands of our local districts, what's wrong with this model, Matt?
A number of things, right? For one thing, I'd say it's sort of fundamental to the whole American system of government is the idea of local control of things. And so, you know, if you look, we've got a federal government for things that only the federal government can handle. We've got a state government for things that only the state government can handle. Well, we got down to the school district level, and the idea was that the people directly involved in the community at the lowest possible level would be able to have influence over and to create a system of schools that is most closely aligned with their values and their, you know, their beliefs and their goals for their children. And so, since I think children are such a special thing, right? They are a gift from God, and we all want to take care of them in a certain way. I think people like the idea of local control. And so when you take that concept and you start saying you're going to make decisions at the state or the federal level, you really remove the power of the parent to be central in making decisions or influencing the decisions that are getting made on behalf of their children. So not only does it not work well because they're so far away, but it's really, I think, a violation of some critical principles in America that local government would be used wherever possible.
Yeah, I think also one thing, I think it really empowered parents to be against discipline in the schools. You know, I know when I was in school, if I got in trouble in school, I was afraid because I knew that when I got home, whatever they did to me at school was in no way going to be worse than what was going to happen to me at home. And I think that really empowered parents to say, hey, wait a minute, why are you disciplining my kid? You know, so I don't necessarily think that was a good thing. So how are discipline practices and policies different, Laurel, from when you were a kid and when you were in school? What do you see? How do you see the shift?
Well, I agree with you that whatever happened at school would not have been as bad as what would have happened at home. I don't remember getting in trouble at home or at school, but I do remember that there were expectations that if a kid would do something at school, you knew the consequence that was going to come to them, and you could see that happen, whether it was a suspension or if it was detention or something. You knew that those things were going to happen. And now it just seems like there's not an expectation of any consequence whatsoever, and so that just continues. You know, I know that some parents have called principals and said, you know, you can't do this to my kid, and the kid will go back to class and say, I'm back in class, and that just leads, I think, to confusion, because there's some kids who just wonder, why does this happen? Why do I behave and another kid doesn't, and then nothing happens? And other kids say, well, if nothing happens, then why don't I start to act up a little bit?
Yeah, Sam, that's actually a question I'd like to pose to you. So, you know, do you see a change in kids' attitude? You know, if he's going to do something and not get in trouble for it, then you know what? Why shouldn't I do it?
Yeah, I think a lot of kids are really like open to the idea of just like being like disrespectful to their teachers, and they don't really care about their actions, and they don't really stay engaged in the class, and so those students kind of could influence other students into maybe behaving that way. And I think a lot of students don't really like care. I guess I said that earlier, but they don't really care about the class, and they don't really care about what their teacher is teaching them, and so they just kind of will say whatever or do whatever, and they don't really expect consequences because they don't really get consequences a lot of the time.
Yeah, that to me that is just amazing. Doing this podcast, I spoke with parents and teachers all over the state, and the thing that just amazed me time after time is the lack of consequences. I mean, there are no consequences. So how can you have law and order in a system where there are no consequences? Even with your own children, as moms. What would happen if we give our children no consequences?
Sheila, can I speak to a little bit more about what's happening?
Absolutely.
You would think from my role that I would have direct knowledge or clear understanding of what's going on, but it's actually been pretty hard. But here's what I have deciphered, and I guess I would say it's what I think as of today is happening. Anything that's measurable in terms of discipline. So if it's a disciplinary action and it can be measured, such as sending a child to the office, or such as a suspension or expulsion, schools are trying hard not to do that. So they've developed either a system of discipline that should happen in the classroom. So that's the reason to pressure teachers to keep kids in class, because if a kid leaves the class, there's an opportunity. We need to know where a child was. So if they leave the class, that can be measured. If they leave the class and go to a disciplinary setup, either the principal's office or somewhere else, that can be measured. So we've created things. The schools now have, many schools have something called a safe room, or they call it something like that. This is a place where a child can go. It's not discipline. It's a place where they can go collect themselves. And this might be a good thing, by the way, for a child who needs to collect themselves, but it's not called discipline. And so what you see is we move away from anything like that. Now you can't capture statistics. And so you were mentioning earlier that there may or may not be some differences in the way that they're treating children. It could be based on race. I'm not sure if that happens or not, but the overall concept is this. If we don't collect statistics that anybody was sent to the principal's office, because we don't send them there, if we don't suspend or expel people other than for certain specific reasons, there's nothing to measure. And if you can't measure it, you can't find disparate impact. And if you don't find disparate impact, nobody can make the statement that there is systemic racism or other problems like that in your schools. And when you start with the federal government, as they did initially, trying to withhold funds from schools for that, and when you move to state government, elements of the state government are pressuring schools for the disparate impact to students, school districts figure it out pretty quickly that they can't afford to have that happening. And so what they're doing instead is looking for solutions that can happen inside the classroom. There's only one problem with that. Those things aren't working very well, and it relies on the teacher to have to do the discipline, and they're supposed to be teaching the class. So then that's the genesis of these rooms. We're like, okay, we don't want it to be the principal's office, but it can't be the classroom, so we'll send them to this room. And these are the types of things that are happening. So again, my perspective, I might be wrong. I'd actually love it if somebody proved to me or told me that I was wrong, but that's what I think is happening.
Yeah, and actually, I think actually you're right. You touched on something. You said that the federal government, actually what they did was they threatened local school districts with either withholding funds or with investigation if they continued to show numbers where black and brown kids were being suspended at higher rates than white kids. So I think that I just, like you said, if it's measurable, they don't want anyone to know. And that's something that, from what I understand, is happening, is that schools, many teachers have told me that they're not allowed to call 911. So if you have a student in your class who's out of control, you're not allowed to call 911. You have to send that kid to the principal's office. They go to the principal's office, and from what I understand, in a lot of cases, they get candy, or they get computer time, or they get some other fun thing, and then they're returned back to the classroom. Which I can imagine as a teacher, Linda. I mean, what does that feel like when you send a disruptive child out of your classroom, and then he goes down to the principal's office and he gets candy and screen time, and then comes back to class?
Yeah, it's definitely a problem. It affects you as a teacher, and the students recognize it right away, everyone. Very disruptive situations I can think of that I sent kids, dangerous situations where I'm conducting a lab that has Bunsen burners, and I send a kid out only for him to come back shortly after, and everyone's wondering, they're concerned, they are agitated, the whole class, because this incident happens, and yet the kid comes back, and now their tension, everyone's tension rises again. No one knows what to do. I don't know what to do because now this kid who just posed a problem, challenged me, is back in there. That makes me concerned for my safety, and of course, I'm trying to protect everyone in the room as well. So yeah, it's really just beyond even unfairness of, oh, you got to leave and you got to relax and there was no discipline, but in fact it just escalates the situation further, and you say, how are we going to handle this situation? How can I continue teaching when the negative aspect has just returned to the classroom?
Mm-hmm. And Laurel, what do your kids say when they come home? Do they talk about, situations like that happen in class? Are you hearing reports like that from your own kids?
I hear that the kids are disrespectful, as Sam had said, and some of that is, I think, just the way that kids interact with adults today is a lot less formal than it probably was when I was growing up. But I think it impacts the students in the classroom in terms of the learning that happens. There's supposed to be class discussion, and nobody will share what I hear from my kids' friends, right? When nobody really shares anything that's meaningful in their own life. They have to come up with something to say, and so it's random things. They want to say the craziest thing because nobody ever wants to share something that's actually going on in their class. I think because the expectations about what might happen if they say something that could be real or what somebody else might say, they try to just keep it all just surface level, and no learning really happens then.
Yeah, so how do these new standards of discipline actually affect your ability, one, to teach, and then another, to learn?
I think, I guess not necessarily for me, but for other students, phones I think is a really big issue, and a lot of students will just constantly be on their phone. Like today, even there was a kid that had his earbuds in and he was on his phone, and the teacher was trying to talk to him, and he had no idea that the teacher was trying to talk to him. So it really, I think, affects their learning, because they don't care about the class. They're not paying attention to what the teacher is saying at all.
But is that distracting to you as a student? I mean, you're sitting there, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Some kid is, on his phone, got his earbuds in. I mean, at some level, I would think that you would be thinking to yourself, really? And that would be very distracting.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely just watching kids just not paying attention, just on their phone. It's a little bit distracting. And then the teachers will constantly have to tell kids that to get off their phones and try to pay attention, and that's definitely distracting too, just to constantly hear that, to put your phone away, get off your phone. And so yeah, those examples with phones with other students are definitely distracting.
I'm surprised that kids are allowed to have their phones in school. I mean, what's the rule on phones in school? Can you not, when kids come to your class, I would think if I was teaching a class, I would have a big bucket, and as everybody walked in the door, I'd just say, drop your phone in the bucket. What's the rule on that? Do you not have a right as a teacher to take away kids' phones?
Long story short, no, you don't. You try, teachers try. I try so hard to make certain that kids don't have the phone, because of course it's directly impacting their learning. Like you said, earbuds in is a common thing. But that's the other thing. Kids are so much smarter than the rest of us at times. I'd have a place for them to put their phone, but then they just preload the songs and the stuff they want to listen to, and they put their phone up there and they have their earbuds in, and they can wear hats and everything in school. So you have no idea what's going on, and they're not paying attention. And then you say, okay, well, I came to the point where I would roll them out of the classroom into my storeroom so that they wouldn't be able to do that anymore. Then they started putting fake phones in there. There's no way for you to keep up with everything when you've got a whole classroom full. And the really sad part is that, that there's a kid who, if you take everything away from them, they don't have earbuds, they're still not going to pay attention. We all know there are some of those kids that we just, continual challenge for us teachers to try and reach them. But when we allow for this, and so many teachers just let this happen because you really don't have much recourse, it allows those kids, now it trends into, well, that's a pretty good kid, but he just maybe finished his work early, so now he's gonna listen to his phone or play a game. Well, you're missing out on that stuff that you were talking about, that interaction. The classroom's about more than just finishing a task. It's about interacting, learning from your peers, listening to what the teacher has to say. So that's the real trouble that I see, is how all of this kind of bleeds in to every kid in the classroom, how it really does affect everyone.
You know, I think one thing that, you know, we want people to know is that this isn't just in inner cities. This isn't just in bad neighborhoods. This is happening in every single school. Well, I would have to say in most schools, you know, all across the state. A lot of times, you know, as parents, we hear these things and we just sort of dismiss them. We think, oh, well, that's happening in Minneapolis. Oh, that's happening in Anoka Hennepin, because that's a big district. They got all kinds of kids. But it really is happening all over, you know, on all different levels. So, Matt, what do you think that parents need to know about the changes in discipline practices?
Well, I think they need to know of the fundamental difference between what school looked like when we were in it. You know, I'm a parent right in this target zone, right? I've got children that are high school age. So I was in school in the 80s and the early 90s, and I as a parent, I think, well, I'm sure that the school handles things the way they always have handled the things. It still looks, some of the schools we went to are still there, right? And our kids might go to them. So we go in and we see them and they look the same, and we assume that what happens is the same as when we were there. So maybe as a parent, I think, if my child is at school every day, if I'm not getting a report that they're skipping class, and if I look at their grades and their grades are an acceptable place, that they must be learning just the way it was when I was there. But the reality is things are really a lot different. The way grades are administered aren't the same. The way kids are evaluated aren't the same. The expectations for students in the class. I think parents would be shocked to find out that their kids could have earbuds in their ears while the class was going on. You know, but we have teachers here telling us that it's a constant battle. We have a student here telling us that, you know, the instruction time they hear repeatedly, put your phone away, take your earbuds out. And so that, you know, even if grades appear normal, even if patterns of behavior appear the way that they used to look when you were there, the learning is different. The standards of the expectations of kids are different than they used to be. And schools will do everything they can to try to convince you that that's not the case, that the standards have never been higher, that the graduation rates have never been higher, and you know. But the reality is, well, let's talk about the learning. Has that ever been higher? And I would submit that, you know, if people took a look at it, they might not be all that happy with it. And some of us have had those experiences as our kids progress forward into college and other places, and we see the struggles. And so I think that's the first thing, is to understand it's different. And that it's different at your school too, because that's the other thing that I will hear. And I converse with a lot of parents and with a lot of school board members, and many of them have this belief that based on where they are, I'm in a small town, I'm in a place you know, that is known to have great schools. We don't have these problems, but boy, it sounds pretty bad at some of the other places I've heard of, like Edina, or you know, I don't intend to name any particular school system, but just to say places that people have always thought were known to be great places, and yet they're having these problems too. How could it be? You know.
I think to speak to something that you said about being looking at things that are measurable, and looking at how you're like, well, my kid must be doing fine. That's another thing that gets hidden in all this, is attendance. Attendance is something that is number one. If you're in the classroom, you should be learning. But it's also one of those things that the schools do a really poor job of recording and keeping track of. And I think that that's purposeful, because we know they came in the morning. Where were they all day? If they're not in the classroom, that maybe is a good thing for some people, because then they can't be disrupting the classroom. So if we simply don't record that they're there, so lax attendance policies are rampant. And that comes back into the middle of the road kid, the kid who well, I don't think I'm probably going to learn anything in there today, so I'm just going to take an extra lunch period. I just won't come back when I'm supposed to. And as teachers, we would talk to administrators like, these kids aren't in class consistently. What are you going to do about it? And they said, well, they were out of class only for 20 minutes, so that's not anything that we're going to be concerned about.
Well, how would they know that the child was out of class only for 20 minutes?
Well,
How would-
because I would tell them, I would say, this student was gone. They did not come back after lunch. They missed 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. They say, that's not a significant amount of time. They were there for some of it. Or again, that piece where we'll meet with them, and then nothing comes of it. And the parents don't know. The parents don't have the information to say, wow, I really wish my student was in class. Shouldn't the parents be aware that their kids are not there?
Yeah, Laura, how do you feel about that, knowing that your students? 'Cause I just think some of the rules and some of the laws that we have today, where kids have all these rights, not that they shouldn't, but they have all these privacy policies, and so if your child is not in school, you don't have a right to know. What do you think about that as a parent?
I would expect to know if my child wasn't in school. So yeah, I would appreciate knowing that. I know that there are some kids who just, they show up 10 or 15 minutes late every day. I hear about that from my kids. I'm assuming my kids are getting there on time because I don't hear any differently.
Yeah, so you just make that assumption as a parent
Yeah.
that everything is okay because you're not hearing differently. Yeah.
It's back to my point. We think it works the way that it used to work when we were there. And when I was in school, if you wanted to go to the restroom or do anything, you had to they wrote these written passes. I'm sure you had them too. So every minute of your time was accounted for. You were either in class or you were traveling to somewhere else, and there was accountability for it. So yeah, if this parent thinks that that's what's happening, only to find out from a teacher that no, actually there could be lots of unaccounted for time and it isn't being treated that way. I wonder how many people know that. I'm actually just learning about it right now myself. So I'm
Yeah.
guessing not many.
Yeah, and that's just what's amazing is that the things that go on in schools today. So as a student, Sam, what would you say is something that your parents don't know that happens in school that most parents would be surprised to find out actually happens in school?
I guess the attendance is one of the big ones. Like a lot of kids will just show up late, or like to any classes where they'll leave and they'll say they want to go to the bathroom, but they won't go to the bathroom. They'll go walk around for 10 minutes or so, or they'll leave before we go to lunch, and then they'll go from where they left to lunch, so they'll just miss that chunk of time. Or they'll come back late from lunch, and a lot of the teachers don't really, they won't mark it or they won't care. And like some teachers, they'll, like Matt said, they'll write a pass, but some they'll just let them go, and then they'll come back way longer than they should have been gone. And everyone knows that what they were doing, that they were not just going to the bathroom.
So what's the environment like in a school? When I was in school, when class was in, there was nobody in the halls. And if you were in the hall and somebody saw you in the hall, they were asking you, why are you in the hall? So what do the halls look like? Because I've heard stories from teachers and students that literally when class is in, there are people all over the place in the halls. Is that the case?
Yeah, I would say there definitely is a lot of kids just kind of roaming around during class, and maybe after a class has started, right after, or I guess a few minutes after, kids will just be walking around, they won't really care about getting there on time because they won't have a consequence for that. So they'll just kind of take their time to get to their class, and then, yeah, they just know that they can do that, and they have that.
So as a student, how does it change your attitude when not even as a student, as a kid, that has parents? What do you think when you know that you're not going to have a consequence? I mean, what does that do to your frame of mind?
Yeah, I definitely I guess I could say I know that there won't be a consequence, so maybe I would want to just do whatever I wanted to, I guess. But I guess not so much for me, but for other students, like they
Never
just-
for you. I know that because I know you're a really good kid.
like for other students, if they see that another kid is not being penalized for something, they like why would they follow the rules or the rules that are made up that have no consequences?
Yeah, that is just shocking to me. I can't tell you on how many levels just doing this work that I've been shocked. I mean, you know, it's just incredible. So Matt, what impact can school boards have on actually making schools safer or changing some of these policies? I mean, is that in your wheelhouse as a school board?
I think it is. I think that the school board generally is a policy-making body, so they determine, I guess you might call it, the rules for how the schools are going to operate. Then the school board hires a superintendent. They directly do, and then the superintendent is responsible to run and operate the whole school system. So, you know, if you start with the fact that they get to choose who the superintendent is, and that they evaluate the superintendent, so they set the goals and objectives for that person. They set the strategic direction. They help with, you know, they confirm the strategic direction that the superintendent and their staff sets for the schools. You know, the board would have the power to oversee that. The board would have the power to change some of these discipline practices if they wanted to, and they would be able to make significant differences. Now, pressures that would impact them from the outside, such as, you know, government levels above. You know, the Department of Education in the state of Minnesota wields significant power. You know, our legislators make laws, but things like the Department of Education sets rules and standards and has a fair amount of control over what happens in schools. The various other agencies of the state, the Department of Human Rights gets involved in various things. And so the school districts fall under pressure to conform to different things. And so, and you know, you saw in the most recent legislative session that that they passed some laws that you know, actually would have taken authority away from school districts for specific courses that have to be taught or curriculums that have to be followed. You know, there are changes to that all the time, but despite that, a school board still has a considerable amount of power to be able to make changes to things, but you know, you have to have a group of people on the board who wants to make the change, and you have to have a staff, I think, that would also support the changes that they want to see made. And you know, those are things that take time to do. You know, the community has to be focused and patient and willing to do the hard work of putting the right people in place.
Yeah, you know, school boards can change policies. They can, you know, but then how do you make sure those policies are being enforced?
Yeah, you have to have systems of accountability. So there have to be measurements. You know, school systems have access to data, and so you can take a look at, you know, results, whether it's academic results as indicators of something that is or isn't happening. Boards can do, you know, direct observations. They can take surveys of the community. They can do things like that. And then, you know, the employees in the district need to know what the policies are and that there are consequences is the other thing. It's not a school system or a school isn't different than any other place of employment. You have rules, you have guidelines for the way that business is to be conducted, and the board would have oversight of that. And so, you know, it's got to be good collaboration between the superintendent and their administration and what the board wants. And it, you know, I would say it isn't necessarily an easy thing to do, but again, it's possible if the desire is there to do it. I know it's possible, but it's a challenge.
So, Linda and Sam, do you guys feel safe at school?
I'll take it first. I'm just thinking of this and all the policy, it really comes down to, yeah, we send kids to school. All parents do because they want them to get an education, and then they trust that they're going to be safe when they're there. And all of this lack of discipline, whether it's, you know, taking care of issues that are in the classroom or taking care of attendance, come back to the fact that we aren't fostering a safe environment for our kids or for our teachers. When kids aren't in the classroom, they're unaccounted for and they're roaming the halls, which in the large high school that I was at, there's tens to hundreds of kids in the hall at any time. They're unaccounted for. And that's when it gets really dangerous. Because why aren't they in class? Is it just because they are taking the long way to get a drink of water, or is it because they're doing something more sinister? And I think that we can see, we've heard reports that we know there's dangerous fights and other things happening in school, drug dealing, things like that. We don't want that environment in our schools. Again, back to the real purpose of them. We're sending kids there to learn, but we're ending up with a situation where the kids aren't even safe. We've got to make some changes so that the students are comfortable, the teachers are comfortable, and not just because they feel good about being there, but they know that they're not going to be hurt when they're there.
And I'll let you answer that question in just a second. But again, I'm really interested because you've been in the system for so many years. You have got to have seen just drastic changes. And I mean, at what moment did it hit you and you were like, wait a minute?
Well, there was a lot of incremental changes and things that I noticed. But the one moment that I think that stands out the most was a chemistry classroom, not mine, was doing a lab. They had Bunsen burners, open flames, things were going on. A student who wasn't in class, should have been in class somewhere else in the building, went into that classroom because that student had a conflict that was on. They were in contact with each other on their phones. So again, another reason not to have phones. The student went into the classroom she shouldn't have been in and started an active fight in this classroom that had Bunsen burners. And it was one teacher in there. I just happened to hear the commotion, so I was able to go in and do what I could to help. But that's an outrageously dangerous situation that never should have happened. And there were a lot of things that we should have in place to keep those kind of things from happening. But that was the moment where I said, wow, this has to change. This is not safe.
Sam, what about you?
I would say, I mean, kind of to your point, or like the student kind of just like went into the classroom randomly. Like I've had classes where like a student that I have no idea who they are. They'll just kind of like show up in the class. And it's kind of shocking because like I don't know who they are. The teacher, they don't know who they are. And so they'll just kind of like be in there, and it's a little weird. Other things like I know like kids will go into the bathroom and they'll vape and stuff, and that's kind of doesn't necessarily make me feel unsafe, but it's a little unsettling. Like I don't really want to go into the like bathrooms in school because it's just like I don't want to go into a situation where I walk in and someone's doing that because they might not want me to like see that or like I guess tell on them for that, and so that could definitely cause like an altercation, I guess.
Yeah, I guess that puts you in a situation where like, you know, am I going to tell on this kid? And I guess the kid's looking at you like, are you going to tell on me? And I could definitely see how that could create some tension.
Mm-hmm.
Do you fear for your kids being at school?
At this point, no. But I know it's a possibility that dangerous things could happen. And danger, I think, is not just physical challenges, right? But it's exposure to drugs and exposure to bad choices and those kinds of things. But I have talked with other friends who are concerned. Mm-hmm.
And concerned
About physical violence at school.
Matt, you look like you're just dying to say something.
Well, I mean, I just asked myself that same question, do I fear? And my answer is probably the same, but it's kind of interesting because I think, even in this conversation here now, I'm hearing things that I didn't know happen. And so there's a question of, do I fear? And my answer might be no, but then there's a question of, should I fear? And I'm feeling like my answer to that might need to be yes. Because, if the scenarios being described are real, and I know they are, then why would we think that it's okay that at any given time 10 to 100 kids could be roaming the hall not under the supervision of the teachers? Right? Again, you go back to that model of school you talked about when we were kids, and when the door closed, the teacher closed the door, and we went to, and class was in session, and there was nobody in the hall. Occasionally, you would get that hall pass, and you'd find nobody there. And I certainly never saw anybody who didn't belong in a classroom coming into it. The idea of a fight occurring inside the classroom to me is mind-blowing. Now, yes, I saw fights in the hallway during passing time for classes, but what was special about that? Well, occasionally. But what was special about that was you had, now at that point, you did have hundreds of kids that were not directly, I mean, there was supervision, but I mean, there was so much motion, it was impossible. And kids knew that that was the opportunity. So that was the reason that fights happened either when classes were passing or after, because the opportunity was there. The opportunity never was there in the classroom. And, you know, talking, when you hear a child say they don't feel like they can use the bathroom at the school, that's not a safe environment. There's different gradients of safety, but certainly we would all expect that at our kids' school that the children could feel they could go to the bathroom. So, you know, I'm feeling like, as a parent too, I should be asking more questions about that and trying to find out more. Now, I'll tell you the challenge is, how do you even do it? I don't have a good answer to that. You know, like, how would a parent do it other than to, I think, listen to what your kids are saying, and then somehow parents have to figure out, okay, how are they going to respond to that? Because I think that is the challenge. Is even if you've heard it, well, now what do I do? You know, I think you'd go to your school, they'd deny it. You can't make an appointment to come to see the chaos, because I would imagine if you did, the chaos that day wouldn't be there. So I don't know exactly what we need to do to figure that out, but that's what I'm thinking.
So what would you, you know, what would an answer be for you? What do you think that we would need to do? What would, you know, in an ideal world, what could happen that could make this different?
Number one, in my opinion, parents should talk to their kids. You know, that first, you know, at lunch or dinner, you're sitting with your kid, you know, what happened today? Nothing. Push more, talk more, and let them know that you're open to hear what they say. Ask those specific questions. They're gonna have some information from something, and hopefully it's not much. I hope that's the case. I hope teachers and the administration are doing everything that they can to make that a positive environment, but it's likely not the case. Then the parents need to call and ask questions, because that's the key, right? All parents care most about their kids. That's their job, that's who they love. So if parents start reaching out, talking more, asking questions of their schools, I think we can start making some positive changes.
Yeah, I just think to me it just seems like it's a really scary time to have a kid in school. You know, just because of all of the things that happen. And I really do not believe that the majority of parents know. As I researched this and, you know, spoke to parents, you know, there were two things that I consistently heard. Either, I had no idea, or, oh, well, that's not happening in my kid's school, you know. And, you know, we know that it is happening in your kid's school. Most likely it's happening in your kid's school. So, well, this has been, you know, an interesting discussion. You know, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to just sort of summarize, you know, again, I know we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but what do you think the answer is? What do you think should be done? What do you think can be done? You know, and you can speak from, you know, a school board member, you can speak from a teacher, from a parent, and then from a student. What do you think can be done? We'll start with, how about we start with you, Sam?
I think discipline is definitely a big thing that can be changed. Like teachers disciplining kids more, like sending them to the office and then maybe them actually getting suspended for something that they would need to be suspended for. So definitely discipline is a thing that I would say needs to be changed so that kids aren't disrupting class, they're not distracting, and so that everyone can just be able to learn better.
Well, you know, that's pretty amazing when you hear a kid saying, we need to be disciplined more. I mean, you know, kids, I mean, I know my kids never said, hey, Mom, please discipline me more. So I just think that's just pretty incredible. What do you think?
Well, I agree with that. I think that sometimes there's so many policies you can't enforce, hardly any. So stick to the policies that you have and make sure that those expectations are clear. I think as parents, we can do two things. One is talk to your kids. And talk to your kids' friends, right? When they're over for dinner and you're just hanging out or you're driving them somewhere, listen to what they say and ask questions about it. And let them know that you want to hear about what happens at school. when I tell my kids that, then I'll start to hear a few more things. And I think as parents, we have to balance, when do you freak out so you won't hear anything? And when do you listen and have a thoughtful response and think about that? And then the second thing as parents is really talking to your school and your school board and working with other parents to say, these are the things that are important to us that we really want to have addressed.
Yeah, just thinking of that incident and the whole conversation here. When the kids were addressed, nothing did ever happen. In fact, it took 30 to 40 minutes before any administration even went to address the issue. So I think it comes back to also some accountability, some realization from the administration to say things need to be better so we can keep kids safe.
I think if parents don't believe that systemic racism is the driver of the difference between rates of discipline, they need to say that. I've said it before. I don't believe that our teachers and our principals are racist in the way that they're handing out discipline, and so there's a root cause. I mean, kids are coming to school in a condition that seems to be deteriorating over time. Many families have problems at home, and the community definitely needs to figure out how we're going to deal with that. But you got to start by addressing the real cause of the issue, and if the cause isn't this racism, if it's something else, we better figure out what the something else is and demand that be worked on instead.
What do you think the something else is?
I think it is. I think it is largely driven by home environments and what's happening at home, and so we know kids are coming to school from homes that aren't conducive. They're not setting up kids well for success at school. So we're going to have to figure out what's missing at home and try to see what we can do to replace that element at school. Discipline is part of it. Some of it is, care and concern for kids. I don't know exactly how to do all of those things. It's pretty hard when you think about it, but we're going to have to, because I think that's really what's affecting the way kids come to school.
Yeah, we have a huge problem in our country with fatherless homes.
Yep.
And I think that's where a lot of this stems from, because when you don't have a dad in the home, I mean, there's just so much that a father provides and I'm not talking about kids of divorce. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking about children who are born and they have never known a father in the home. And the United States has the highest rate of fatherless homes in the entire world. So I think discipline is designed to keep order, and it's designed to keep kids safe, and it should have no color. It should not matter, that should not be